Hi guys, back for part three. Okay, so I want to spend a little more time today talking about paraphrase, um, and at the same time to give you some sort of sample body paragraphs from an essay on this topic. So remember what we talked about last week? That the most important thing about paraphrasing is using your own words and sentence structure, so not just looking up synonyms. Um, and then accurately conveying the points of the original, that's the next most important thing. But using your own words and sentence structure, that's the most important. Um, in the context of a paper, paraphrase is rarely pure. Um, a, because it often melds with summary, and because B, it's also sometimes like sort of a cross between explaining a source's point um, and restating it. So let's have some examples. Okay, so on the left I have a paragraph from Scholes, and on the right a paraphrase that could stand some improvement. So this is Scholes' last paragraph, and it's not one we talked about last time, so this will also be an opportunity for us to go over it a little bit. An audience can understand this that can understand this commercial is an audience that understands narrative structure and has a significant amount of cultural knowledge as well, including both data, how baseball leagues are organized, for instance, and how the game is played, and myth, what constitutes success, for example, and what initiative is. At a time when critics such as William Bennett and E.D. Hirsch are bewailing our ignorance of culture, it's important to realize that many Americans are not without culture. They simply have a different culture from that of Bennett and Hirsch. Okay, so just for some context, I am pretty sure that all of you are too young. Even I am too young to really have known about William Bennett and E.D. Hirsch. So they were these two cultural critics, these scholars in the 80s, who were who wrote these books um, arguing that, like, Americans don't know anything anymore. We don't know the classics. We've stopped reading books. We don't. Yes, even in the 80s, people were saying those things about American culture. And so Scholes clearly, like, thinks that that kind of lament, Americans just watch TV, they go to their sports games, instead of, like, knowing about real culture, Scholes thinks that that kind of argument is baloney, right? Um, because he thinks that commercials are culture, right? And that our ability to sort of just understand what a commercial is doing is really important and suggests our cultural knowledge. So, okay, so that's what Scholes is saying in that paragraph. Okay, so here's a paraphrase. When viewers comprehend a commercial, they show that they understand stories and a lot about culture, like how baseball works and what it means to be successful. Some people think that Americans are ignorant, but that's not really true. They know a lot. Okay, so this version of this paraphrase, the color coded version, can sort of explain why this particular paraphrase could stand a little bit of improvement. I mean, it's not terrible, but notice what the color coding reveals. Notice that it's just a little bit close in terms of structure to Scholes' first sentence. It's like it's not fully digested. This is my disgusting metaphor for paraphrasing that I think actually can help you. It's like, I mean, paraphrasing needs to be kind of like eating, like you eat food and then it comes out in a very different form. You know what I'm saying? It's like, but like a very different. It's like it's very different. So that's like there's not enough like digestion happening here. So here's a version that is improved. Scholes positions himself against cultural critics from the 1980s, such as E.D. Hirsch, who argued that Americans lacked basic cultural knowledge. For Scholes, the average American possesses a lot of cultural information. They have to in order to understand commercials and to feel the effects of cultural reinforcement. So notice how this one, I mean, like this paraphrase is structurally different, right? It talks about Hirsch first rather than putting it at the end. So it's changed the structure of the original paragraph more thoroughly, which makes it something of an improvement over this one, which sticks too close to the structure of the original. The other thing I want to point out about this particular paraphrase is these, what do we call them? Everybody quiz yourself? That's right, signal phrases. Scholes positions, for Scholes. Those are really useful when you're putting a paraphrase into your paper, right? Because they are sort of like the flashing red lights around your paraphrase that say, hey, this isn't me just saying this. This is me telling you what Scholes says. Okay, so when you're actually in a paper, you're very rarely going to need, like a pure paraphrase or summary, like what you did for homework 2. And you have to remember your priority. Your priority is your thesis. Your thesis drives the structure of the paper, right? And so you need to use what parts of the secondary source you need for your argument. So when you're talking about Scholes in your essay, your goal is not just to talk about Scholes, because I told you you needed to talk about Scholes. Your goal is to prove your thesis. So you're going to talk about parts of Scholes' essay, but I bet there are parts you're not going to talk about because your thesis is the boss of this paper, and stuff that doesn't fit into your thesis does not enter the paper. So summarize where you just need an overall main point, and paraphrase for main concepts that are key in your paper or where specific details are significant for you. So let's work our way through an example. So imagine a paper with the thesis that cultural reinforcement no longer works the same way in commercials because American society is more fractured and unequal than it was in the 1980s. So another thesis that takes Scholes as its they say. So here's a sample paragraph about Scholes in that paper, and I'm just going to kind of skip over to this version, which breaks down the structure of the paragraph. With his concept of cultural reinforcement, Scholes describes how commercials connect to viewers on a deep level. They do this in 2 ways. First, commercials make people feel good about their beliefs and make them feel they are right. For example, Scholes explains how a Budweiser commercial makes people feel like the American dream is a reality and that the underdog can succeed against all odds. Second, commercials make people feel part of a community of other people who share the same belief. In his example, someone who understands the commercial feels bonded with other Americans. In these 2 ways, commercials go far beyond just selling a product. They connect to people through their deeply held beliefs. Okay, so I've mapped out for you there on the right how this paragraph is related to Scholes' essay. So note, at the beginning, we have a bun, right? A bun, remember my paragraph burger model, right? Where the bun tells us the point of the paragraph. And that bun makes it clear that this paragraph is about Scholes, right? From the beginning, we know this paragraph is explaining Scholes' argument about cultural reinforcement. The first red section paraphrases a paragraph of Scholes, but only part of that paragraph. The blue part kind of zooms out, right? And it summarizes a couple of paragraphs from the middle of the essay, just capturing a highlight. With the green, we drop back into a paraphrase of the rest of that paragraph we started earlier, and the red deals with that same paragraph. And then at the end, we tie everything together with a bottom bun that adds in some content from a later paragraph. So notice how this paragraph is really, it's very paraphrasy with respect to one paragraph, and then it's sort of pulling highlights from the rest of the essay. So it's a combination of summary and paraphrase. But this is a good example of a kind of paragraph that you might have that explains Scholes' essay in your paper. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of an explanatory paraphrase. That's not like a technical term, I totally just made it up. It's just a way to talk about a paraphrase that is a paraphrase that really kind of goes beyond what your source said himself. Um, so, such as like using your own examples to clarify what you think schools means. And that's totally fine. And you just have to be clear that you're doing that. So here's an example of a paragraph about schools from a paper that goes beyond schools to like explain him. Scholes argues that the Budweiser commercial he analyzes works because American pride in baseball runs deep in our culture. We all shout against what is blatantly wrong in the game, and no matter who wins, no one can ignore the presence of a great game played. Whoever is on the field has been tested, and you can have the men who seem to think they are the best and strike out every time, and the humble players that everyone can count on to play their best. To expand on Scholes' point, consider that even during World War II, baseball still had the best players as women. America loves the game so much, the boys of summer became the girls of summer. This game, baseball, showcases talent no matter who you are. If you're willing to give your all for the game, you'll play. Baseball's not called America's game for nothing, even if what happened on the diamond is not a good representation of what happens on the streets of our cities. So that example about women playing baseball during World War II, totally not in the Scholes essay. But I think it's effective because it helps this writer to explain Scholes' point. Notice that the writer is very clear when she moves beyond Scholes, right, with that second clause in red, right, to expand on Scholes' point. Notice again also how the whole paragraph totally begins with a bun that says in, flashing lights, this paragraph is about Scholes. It's not me, it's Scholes. It's me explaining Scholes' point. Super important. So you've got these tools in your belt. You can paraphrase, you can do a combo of summary and paraphrase, like moving back and forth between those, and you can do a more kind of explanatory paraphrase that uses your own examples. All of those are possibilities. Let's review just a little bit about quoting. Remember that quoting is not a substitute for paraphrasing, and that you should only quote the smallest amount you need, in part just to keep us focused on your ideas rather than having us like totally fall into your source. And only quote when you care about the way someone puts an idea, right? So quote a really great phrase, but don't quote just to not have to paraphrase. Remember that you always, always, always want to introduce a quotation with a signal phrase. Scholes argues that, and that usually you want to do that with a paraphrase too. Remember that a quote should never be its own sentence, and that you've got to analyze, explain, or otherwise use your quote. That a quote does not just sort of let the source explain itself, right? Okay. Here's an example. If you've ever watched a baseball game, you know that when an ump makes a call and it's questionable, they do a slow motion replay. They show the play at a slower speed so you can see how close the call was, and in fact the ump was right that the player was out. We know these moves the way the contemporaries of Aeschylus and Sophocles knew the myths upon which the Greek tragedies were based. Scholes. Throughout the United States, baseball is a sport that we all know and understand. Most of us experience it through television. Oh my god, I can stop. You see how the quote is just like, blah, like just thrown in the middle. It's like you're making a cake and you forgot to like mix up the ingredients. So you take it out of the oven and it's just a big lump of flour. No. Better. This commercial works by invoking a set of images that are basically a commonly known ritual in our society. If you've ever watched a baseball game, you know that when an ump makes a call and it's questionable, they do a slow motion replay. They show the play at a slower speed so you can see how close the call was, and in fact the ump was right, the player was out. According to Scholes, we draw on familiar rituals like these to understand commercials in the same way that, quote, the contemporaries of Aeschylus and Sophocles knew the myths upon which the Greek tragedies were based, and so on. Notice that the bun brings in the idea of ritual, which helps to connect the quote. And then note that the quote gets cut down and integrated into a sentence that uses a signal phrase and explains the quotation. Such an improvement.